All right, guys, a little different episode today. We had an agent come over. Her name's Nicole Leiniger, and she's a real estate agent here in the Lake Norman area. She does a ton of business. She was on the top 50 list this year. So she is a well-versed real estate agent, but she has a content crew that came over, and she wanted to ask questions to Tiff about things that her buyers or clients need to know kind of throughout the closing process. They talk about fraud. Obviously, they always like to get some good and interesting, juicy stories, some of the craziest things that's happened in the closing room. But there's a lot of really, really good and valuable information. And so we cut up a little bit of this interview from Nicole, and we're kind of putting it on our channel so you guys can hear from a real estate agent perspective what questions you guys would be asking an attorney so you can help your clients better. Now, obviously, if you guys ever want to bring over some sort of content crew, ask questions to our attorneys or myself about marketing, you are always welcome to do that. We're always available. We always want to help you guys out. So if you want that, by all means, just ask. And other than that, let's get into the episode.
Want to give everybody an idea of the process of closing and what happens once a buyer goes under contract. So as an agent, once a house goes under contract, I get to you the needed information, such as like an executed contract. Mm-hmm. What happens once I submit a contract to you? How does it start?
Once you submit an executed offer to purchase to our office, the first thing that we're going to do is open a file in our system that controls basically all of the accounting and all of the documentation. And then we begin the title search, which, as you know, is the most critical part of what the attorney does for the buyer in a real estate closing. So we're looking back at all of the records for taxes, judgments, finding out if there are any open deeds of trust on the house that need to be paid off, basically anything that could prevent the buyer from obtaining clear title at closing. So that's the very first thing we do. And then once we've got title all wrapped up and we know that there are no issues, then we're obtaining title insurance for the buyer, collecting all of the invoices, all of the information from the lender as far as what charges will be on the closing statement, getting that all of that prepared, sent out to the agents, reviewing the loan documents, and then getting all ready for closing and the signing.
I know there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes.
That was an oversimplification, but yes.
But no, just, you work directly with the lender, mm-hmm. with the buyer, with the seller. So it's a kind of a well-oiled machine for everything to go smoothly.
Also a little bit like herding cats, but
right.
Not when we work with people like you. So
and then as far as like a buyer, I know that, they go through the pre-approval process. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of things that they can do on the front end. Is there anything that they can do to prepare for a closing? I mean, besides like the needed documents, what is something that, a buyer or a seller could do to help the closing process?
Mm-hmm. A few things. One, keeping their documentation organized. I think you probably coach buyers all the time with their lenders to be responsive. And if they don't have their documentation organized, like their bank statements, et cetera, that makes it a little bit more difficult to get the clear to close. Mm-hmm. Same thing with sellers. We're trying to track down their payoffs so that we can close on time. But if a seller is not providing that information in a timely manner, then we're not going to be able to close on time because we need to know exactly what needs to be paid at closing. So having that information stored in a place that's accessible, that they can find it and provide it when needed, that's one thing. The other thing I would say is to level set expectations from the beginning, because even the best closings have something that maybe doesn't go perfectly. Mm-hmm. And understanding that there are sometimes things outside of the party's control that even the best agents, the best attorneys can't control. Knowing that going into it makes it a little bit easier to navigate when things inevitably kind of go off the track.
Right. Because there's always something.
There is always something.
And then when is a file ready for closing? When can you call me and say we're clear to close, mm-hmm. and we have the time and the date set?
Yeah, so if from our perspective, a file is ready to close when we have clear title. So sometimes things get delayed when a seller has something that they have to correct on their end. When we have lenders clear to close, so they have their own separate process that they're going through underwriting and determining a borrower's creditworthiness, whether they can lend to them. When we have all of the buyer's funds in our trust account to be able to close, have all the lender's funds in the trust account as well. And we have all of the documents from the lender that need to be executed at closing. So sometimes we might not get those lender documents until the people are in our office, waiting at the table, like, when do we have our loan documents? But once all of those things are in our office, that's when we can say confidently, we are closing this thing.
And it brings to mind when you talk about funds being available and in your office for closing, that just brings up fraud. It makes me think about that. So what are some things that, I as an agent can prepare my buyers when wiring money, or what kind of things do we do to prevent any issues or any fraud?
I have these things that I call the always and the never list. So on my always list, there's just one thing, is to prepare your clients that they will always be a target of fraud. So if a buyer is going through this process, or even a seller, and they're involved in closing a real estate transaction, they should assume always that they will be solicited for wire fraud. So they're going to receive fraudulent wiring instructions at some point, and that makes them a lot more keen to scrutinize every detail in every email they get. That way they're looking at the actual email address. Is this who usually emails me? Is there a 1 where there should be an L? Did I receive wiring instructions at the beginning of this process and now they're changing? It just makes them way more cautious, and assuming that they will be targeted is a really good way to make sure that they're not actually targeted, or that if they are targeted, they know what to do to not become a victim. And then on my never list is an attorney will never change their wiring instructions. So the wiring instructions you receive at the beginning of the process, for example, in our office, we send them at the very beginning with the engagement letter. We're not going to change those. So if you receive something purporting to be, we've had to change our wiring instructions, use this, it's fake.
Right.
The other thing on my never list is there is never a good reason not to call and verify wiring instructions before you send the money. And I mention this because people are so stressed getting up to the closing.
There's so much going on.
There's a lot going on. They've got movers. They're trying to pack. They might be wrangling young kids, and it's very stressful. But I submit that it's way more stressful to lose all of your money to wire fraud. So take the extra 10 minutes, call the closing attorney at a number that you have independently verified to be correct, and make sure that the wiring instructions are exactly correct before any money is sent anywhere. So there's never a good reason to skip that step.
I always tell my clients, there's no stupid questions. Like I would rather have people ask the question or double check than make a mistake. And same thing, before any wire is sent, whether it's $10 or 10 million, to call your office directly and just read it over the phone before sending it.
Exactly. And we've unfortunately all known people that have lost money to wire fraud. We've seen, people faking, verifying wiring instructions. It is becoming so rampant, and it's because when we get more vigilant, the scammers get more creative. So we can't relax on this. We've got to stay the course here.
And like I said, on your YouTube channel, you always share some crazy stories. Do you have a favorite or one of the craziest things that has happened during a closing?
I have one that's a favorite, and I'm going to have to censor it just slightly. I was doing a closing for a family that had some young children, and there was a boy that he was probably 3.5, maybe getting close to 4. And he was funny, rambunctious all over the place. And at the end of the closing, we finished signing. They're super excited. And this little boy comes to me and he says, "Give me my keys, B." And I was like,
he said that to you or the other
to
agent?
me. Yeah, he said that to me. And his parents were mortified, and they were like laughing but nervously. And what I just imagine is like the parents being kind of excited and like, at the end of this closing, we're gonna be like, "Give me my keys." And the son heard it and was like, "Oh, this is the time. This is when we're supposed to say that." But so that was one of them. And then the other time was a single dad was buying a house for him and his young kids. And the daughter was at school and she couldn't be at the closing. So she gave him her flamingo pen to use to sign all the closing documents. So usually my favorite stories have to do with kids.
Right. It was his good luck pen.
It was. And I do have a picture of that. It was really sweet.
That's cool. Has there ever been anything that was just completely surprising?
Yes. So, as you know, real estate is not always super fun. Did you ever meet my late law partner, Ben Thomas?
Yeah.
Okay. So, when I got into real estate, I started as a litigation attorney. Not many people know that because I put that in the past, but I was helping Ben. He was going on a trip to Egypt with his family. And I was like, I'll cover real estate so that you don't have to shut down for 2 weeks. So, I come in to do a closing, and it happens to be a guy who, he was very angry the second I sat down because he found out he had to bring cash to the closing. And his girlfriend had been managing the entire process with the lender. And when he found out that he had to bring about $500 to closing, that was all his cash to close was, he lost it. So he'd been threatening the lender. I sent the lender to a different room and said, let me try to calm this guy down. And I just sat him down and said, listen, I'm the only person in this building that can help explain to you what is going on right now. So if you don't let me talk, I can't do that. And that was not the right thing to say to him. He stood up over the table. He reared back. And before he could even start throwing
Swinging.
a punch, I said, get out. I don't care if you ever buy a house. If you do, it will not be here. So I was like, great. This was a great introduction to real estate. And now that I'm thinking about it, the second most craziest thing that happened was during that same time, in the loan package. I know you're familiar with the name affidavit where it's all of the different aliases. And I had a couple buying real estate. They're buying not their first home together, but it had been a while since they'd had a closing. And we got to the alias sheet listing all the different names. And usually it's a cute little, oh, what's on your list? What's on your list? That's funny. They misspelled your name. This woman, her face, just all the color drains out of her face. And she tries to sign her name as quickly as possible. Her husband looks at the sheet and he said, what's that name? That's funny. What's that name? And she went silent. So he said, honey, what's that name? And come to find out, she had been married before, but had never told him. And that's how he found out. So I gave them the room, said, take your time, talk to each other. 2 hours later, they call me back in and we finished the closing. And I've seen them in town since. They're still together, but that was wild. So Ben gets back from his Egypt trip. And I'm like, I thought you said real estate was like the happy, calm. Like this was more action than I've seen in a courtroom in years.
In the 2 weeks he was gone.
Yes. Yeah. And he said, are you serious? You got the marriage thing? I've been practicing 30 years. That never happened to me. So, I was so lucky to get to see that.
So be sure you're honest before you buy a house with your spouse.
Yeah. Maybe tell your spouse if you've been married before.
Good tip. And then after closing, do people need to do anything as far as I know every state is different. I've done real estate in a couple different states and sometimes people get the keys right away. Sometimes they have to wait a few days for it to actually close. So what is the process in North Carolina?
Yeah. So in North Carolina, we're what's called a pure race notice jurisdiction, meaning it's the first to the courthouse. And I could get into the history of why that is, but it's super boring. But suffice to say, you are not the owner of the property until the deed has recorded. So until then, the seller still owns the property. So when it comes to giving up keys, it's in the seller's discretion. If they give over the keys before the deed has recorded, that is out of the kindness of their heart. They're not obligated to do it. Our standard offer to purchase says possession to be delivered once the deed is recorded. So in North Carolina, you should expect to not get the keys until the deed has recorded. And then you mentioned after the fact, what happens. Really, after the deed is recorded, there's not much left to do, but there are some administrative things that come along. Like if you obtained an owner's title insurance policy, you're going to get that in the mail 30 to 60 days after closing. You'll get the original deed mailed to you after closing, which by that point, it's just a keepsake because once it's stamped at the Register of Deeds, it's official, it's the real deal. The seller is going to get a copy of the tax bill for the year that they closed in. I'm sure you get a ton of calls every year. What do I do with this tax bill? I sold this house. It's just it's a courtesy. It's an administrative thing. If you own the property that year, you're entitled to a copy of the tax bill. And then be prepared to get some scam letters from people trying to make money off of you. The one that I know for sure people will get in North Carolina is asking you to pay money for a copy of your property records. And while the people do actually send the records they're selling you, they're just all free that you can get online yourself anytime you want. So you do not have to pay for copies of your property records. But other than that, once the deed is recorded, just pay your bills and you'll be fine.
Right. And that's what I tell people too, after closing, all that mail that they will get, because now it's recorded. Just call me, call their lender, call whoever, just to say, like, is this legit? Do I need to do anything?
Yeah.
With it?
If there's
90% of the time, it's just junk.
Exactly. If there's somebody asking you for money that's not your mortgage payment, it's probably not legit. But you've got all these resources. We work as a team. So call whoever you need to make sure that it's real or not.
Right.